What is going on in the world? Nobody knows. We're going to talk about it today. The first thing we know, though, the date. The date is something else. Let's just pay attention to the date, right? It's the 22nd of February, 2022, right? So this does a few things amazing. They call it Tuesday, and it's on a Tuesday, as in TWO's day, Tuesday on a Tuesday, right? And Tuesday on a Tuesday is also a palindrome, right? So you can look at it backwards and it'll be the same. And it's also an anagram. You can flip it upside down and it would be the same, right? Not this version, but a digital version, right? Those numbers. So any way you look at February 22nd, 2022, it looks the same, right? Yet on this day, we have a world that we can't even make sense of, right? We've got Russia and Ukraine. I don't know, is there a war? I'm not sure. Is there? We don't know, right? We predicted no conflict. Was there a conflict? We don't know. We saw some things burn, some things are happening. At the same time, I go and listen to the president of the United States today say, well, we're going to do some sanctions. This is the start of an invasion. We'll see. It looks like the ruble's going up. Americans were warned about their gas prices. They would be affected, that gas would be expensive because of this. So what's going on here, right? What's going on? Well, I think I have the right way to look at it today. So you've heard a lot of people breaking down the situation in Russia and Ukraine. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to break it down and tell you what to think and what's going on. But I am going to try and boil it down to a few things that we can all agree on in order to move forward, because I don't want to do one of these things where we don't know what's going on and then we go forward. So what can we boil the situation in Ukraine down to its most basic elements? I'll give you a quick background of my own experience with Ukraine, just so you know, I'm not coming completely out of nowhere, not claiming to be an expert, just telling you that I know where it is on a map, right? So with Ukraine heavily involved in Canada, Canada and Ukraine are sort of tied at the hip. A lot of Ukrainians move to Canada. It's a major source country for Canadians. Wayne Gretzky, probably the most famous Canadian, one of them anyway. I guess Jordan Peterson is the most famous these days, but there was a time when Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, was the most famous Ukrainian. Ukrainians were given that land grants, right? So they populated a lot of the Canadian Midwest. There are tons of communities around Canada that continue to speak Ukrainian. The Ukrainian language is a big deal there. My mother-in-law is from Ukraine. My wife, that means she's half Ukrainian. So all kinds of stuff. And then with the Bitcoin piece, a lot of Ukrainians in that. I think it's one of the countries with the most Bitcoin per capita. And so I've seen that over the years. On the Russia end, I traveled through Russia once. I took the train and spent some time in Moscow and was there in the early days of Putin, and also to have had a professional relationship with a man named Boris Nemtsov, who was the prime minister of Russia. He was gone on the bridge right above the Moscow River. But he came to Canada during the Pussy Riot troubles and was there because he was sure he was going to be arrested, and he was soliciting favor amongst all kinds of governments. Weird, there was a huge snowstorm and no one showed up to his little gathering. I was one of the only people who made it, and we hit it off and became friends, and I was sad to see when he was assassinated not long after. So all that to say, I know where it is. I have a somewhat of an idea of the languages spoken in Ukraine and these things. So I only mention it just to say that I'm not some other person who learned about Ukraine yesterday and I'm giving you lessons, although I'm not going to be here to give you lessons on the history and all that stuff. Just a few things, just a few little things that we can all agree on. I started today with a date for a very important reason. I didn't know this, but exactly 8 years ago to the day, February 22nd, 2014, was the day that the current regime in Ukraine took control of the country, because the pro-Russian forces were driven out that day. There was a vote in parliament that removed the president of Ukraine then, Viktor Yushchenko. He left that day, exactly to the day that many years ago. Putin gave a speech last night referring to both this day and that day. And he said there was a coup that happened then, right? I don't think that that is very well understood amongst Americans, Western audiences, that Putin believes that was a coup. I'm not here to argue whether or not it was a coup, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is Putin believes it was a coup. That's all I'm saying, right? So Putin believes there was a coup, all right? That's it. That's the first part of things we can all agree on. I'm not saying there was a coup. I don't know. Like I said, that's the point. We don't really know, right? Putin says there was a coup, so let's go with that. The second piece is that when there was a coup, certain financial relationships began that involved America and Ukraine that were different than before, right? Now, I don't know which relationships, and I'm not going to go through all of them because I can't. That's the problem. I know of one relationship that we know because it's public, and that is the current president of the United States' son. If you remember, before COVID in early 2020, there was an impeachment of the US president. And what was it over? It was over whether or not he had asked Ukrainian government to look into Joe Biden and his son, because that was some form of affecting and meddling in the election that was to come, right? If you remember, all of this is kind of hard to remember because COVID comes right after. But if you remember, President Trump was impeached in 2020, January. The first time he was impeached twice. It was the first time he was impeached. And it was because he wanted to know more about financial relationships, which involved the current president of the United States' son, right? So all I'm saying is there's financial relationships. You can go into the database to see what kinds of things they're spending on. The US government in Ukraine, there's a database of foreign expenditures or something like that. It's a public database, so I just was poking around in it. There's stuff like schools and $500,000 for this and $1 million for that. I'm not going to pour through it all. I just was wondering what kind of registry there was, and there's all kinds of stuff there, right? They even fight fentanyl addiction. They even fight fentanyl addiction in Ukraine. Would you believe it? They do that, right? Amazing. So it should happen more here, but it's happening there. So that's at least a good thing. So we've got, these 8 years, and at the end of it, we can conclude, I think everyone can conclude that Putin believes there was a coup 8 years ago, and American financial interests have increased, although we do not understand to what extent. Right? We don't understand to what extent. So from there, people say that Russia, this is kind of like a euphemism from Russia, that it's an oil company with an army, right? It's an oil company with an army. And in their mind, when we see this coup, right, they're an oil company with an army, could we not at least agree that perhaps if they thought there was a coup, that what's being believed is competition for that oil industry competition, like another gas station opened up that also has an army, right? So now there's 2 gas stations and 2 armies, not necessarily countries, right? 2 gas stations and 2 armies. Because what America exported over there isn't exactly a country, it's some nation building pieces, but not exactly a country. The thing is, we don't really know what's going on over there, and that's important, and I'll get to that in a second. So we've got all these stories about what's going on in Russia. We don't really know. We know money is definitely at play. We know the oil industry is definitely at play, but what else, right? We don't know. Now, I'm going to tell a few more news stories and I'm going to tie them together. The next one is back to Canada. Donations, right? I saw a map today doxed of all the people who'd been donating to the convoy. And it was sort of a map of one of the provinces of Ontario, and you couldn't see anything. It was just the little needles on it of all the people that had donated, because it was pretty widespread, a lot of small donations. And the person on Twitter was saying, go find out if your neighbor did this and give them heck, go give them heck if they did this. So that's already out there. And it was said by the Canadian government, who got their emergency powers yesterday, that the sanctions against individuals will continue, right? So Biden put sanctions on the Russian oil and gas companies today, right? He announced them today. And we also heard about sanctions in Canada on individuals today. So oil companies, individuals, right? Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. Matt Taibbi wrote on his Substack today. So since Matt Taibbi left Rolling Stone, I think he's much better. I liked him before. I always thought he was one of the people who could sort of see the whole field and both sides. And I always really liked his coverage. But now that he's on his own, spot on. And his article today is When Boring People Turn Dangerous, Canada's Insane Power Grab. The Canadian government's decision to freeze bank accounts in the trucker protests is a mad leap towards bureaucratic dystopia. He also, in the article, and you should all read it, it was great, he points out that Andrew Ross Sorkin, the morning host of Squawk Box, a show that I've been on many times with Andrew, I didn't know this about him. I never understood this. He wrote a piece during the Pulse nightclub shootings and the Las Vegas shootings, talking about how credit card companies could have this important role in determining, finding out, rooting out who is likely to be a mass shooter. He said it could even go further. I saw in the article he mentions, Matt Taibbi mentions and relates the anecdote about when Andrew Ross Sorkin was covering that Snowden stuff and said, well, I think even Glenn Greenwald should go to jail or at least be in trouble for doing this, right? So a lot of this stuff from Andrew Ross Sorkin has been around for a long time. And we see a lot of this from NBC affiliated news networks, right? And if you go to Glenn Greenwald's Twitter feed, you'll see that he has a constant stream looking into what NBC is up to and what messaging they get out there. So right away, but we don't understand. We don't know. On the outside, we could say NBC, what are they doing? We don't know. Andrew Ross Sorkin, is there any connection between policy, any form of surveillance, any form of national security apparatus? We don't know, right? Glenn Greenwald says it. I'm not the judge of that, right? That's not what I'm here to talk about. We also got news about the DAO hacker. So if anyone wasn't aware, back in 2016, there was a hack of Ethereum, the Ethereum blockchain, because a protocol had been created called the DAO. Was going to be this thing that invested in projects, and it was great. And then it was hacked and it broke, and Ethereum had to fork, and they're still living with some of the debates around that. But the attacker was just unveiled today, and especially the way they had done the washing of the money they'd stolen over the years. And what was really amazing in the breakdown, and this is from Chainalysis, using their graph analysis tools, using their ability to go through all of the mixers. And what they basically said was they were even able to demix Wasabi transactions, which we thought was a privacy additive to add some confidentiality and all that stuff. But that was one of the jarring things, was that, wow, Chainalysis was even able to track the use, because it went from Ethereum to Bitcoin, and that's how they ended up finding it. So amazingly, Chainalysis found this, and people are saying, "Oh my goodness, what's going on?" And then, especially with the Canadian stuff, Zuko, the creator of Zcash, came out and said, "People have just woken up to the necessity and urgency of politically neutral money. People think of Bitcoin, but due to its transparent architecture, Bitcoin cannot be that. It can't protect people from the powerful." All right, so we've got a situation in Ukraine that we don't really understand because we can't really follow the money. We do know there are sanctions now, and there'll be all kinds of investigations into how money's flowing. We won't necessarily see any of it. We see the opposite end of that. So at one end, we see the very powerful that you can't have any transparency for. At the other end, you see the very weak who we have an abundance of transparency for. We have all these calls to find out more about them, and who doxed who, and who gave what to whom, and who gave money to the truckers. And so that's all happening at the same time, right? And then you've got this apparent weakness in Bitcoin, where it's not private enough, and people are following it. And so maybe we need this other coin because it can get over the problems, right? So too many not enough sanctions. Too many sanctions, not enough transparency. Too much transparency, too many sanctions. That's Canada. And then finally, this situation where does the tech make a difference? Can it solve anything, right? Well, today I'm going to look at a theory called the theory of the firm to sort of tie all of these stories together, right? Russia, United States, Canada, right? How to tie them together. The theory of the firm. The theory of the firm is an idea written by a lawyer. He lived to be about 100 years old. Can you believe that? Ronald Coase. He was a lawyer at the University of Chicago in that whole Milton Friedman world. And Ronald Coase never wrote a book, wasn't an economist, but won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1991 for 2 law review articles he wrote. And that's really sort of the beginning of the merger of law and economics as I understand them, and practice them as someone who has a legal background and legal education. And what he said was the theory of the firm is basically, why are there companies, was what he was trying to understand. How did this happen? How did we create companies in the first place? And his argument was that in a world of external transactions that have no friction, that are easy to do, no friction external transactions, everyone would kind of be an independent contractor, and everyone would be able to, and a friction on an external transaction can even be a negotiation, right? The time it takes to negotiate with someone. So what he said was all these external transaction externalities, he called them, get internalized. And that was the genesis and the primordial soup, if you will, of how companies grew. Transaction internalization, right? So what that means is basically if you're a company and you go out and hire a lawyer as an on-staff general counsel lawyer for your company, instead of hiring a law firm every time or a different accountant every time, you have them on staff. You have an on-staff marketing person, you have an on-staff lawyer, an on-staff accountant, and so on and so forth, right? So companies have grown over the years by internalizing more and more of these transactions. Technologies can come around and shake the box and force transactions to be external again. But the predominant factor has been, so far, transaction internalization. What it ends up doing to the system looks like this. And Canada provides the perfect example of what's going on. Because true law, right, and this is where economics start meeting the law. True law can be seen in a noise complaint, which is really what was going on in Ottawa. It was a noise complaint, right? And the courts treated it as a noise complaint. Noise complaint was what it was, no honking, right? The golden goose that keeps on honking, right? So the honking was the issue. When you have a noise complaint, you can imagine the legal system working really well, right? You be quiet at this time, you can make noise until that time, and we're done, right? That's how the legal system ought to work, right? And that's what happens when no transactions are internalized. You can understand the pendulum of justice quite well there, right? And that's why we use a pendulum the scale as an icon for justice, right? In courts, right? It's a scale, you weigh things, right? And justice is supposed to be blind on purpose, right? Because they're supposed to just be the same weight. What happens is when you internalize transactions, right? You make a company, sure, right? You internalize them. You end up tipping the balance, right? That's where lobbying comes in, right? That's the kind of distortion that lobbying brings into political market economy, right? So because there are these things, you end up not recognizing the system. You end up not recognizing either the legal system. And in this case, we can talk about many of the systems that are now underlying the modern world, the world that our grandparents built after World War II. Look at international order, right? We don't know anything about these transactions. All we know for a fact, the one new transaction that was internalized is whatever apparatus America set up in Ukraine, there was room for the current president of America's son to get paid, but you weren't allowed to look into it, right? You weren't allowed to look into it. Now, in the case of Canada now, with the truckers, right, it's the same thing. They purposefully used transaction transparency as a way to tip the scales and add that piece to it. Now, when I see what happens with the DAO and the Wasabi wallet forensic audit, and when I see what's going on with what Zuko said, I say, well, wait a minute here. We got a problem, right? We got a problem, because if Bitcoin isn't private, then all of this stuff can continue to get gobbled up, right? Well, that's not really the case. Don't forget that Bitcoin has a public ledger, right? That was always the point, that you could see transactions. What you do to obfuscate yourself individually is a different story. So when we look at these stories of Russia, Coase Theorem, right, what we see is maybe they have created a gas company with an army in Russia. We just don't know. Now, we're going to see with what's going on in the next few weeks, gas, because of all these new sanctions, gas, energy prices, and Bitcoin continue on this track, right? We're going to see them heading towards each other like they have been for a long time now, but even more so. If Putin ever starts selling Bitcoin for oil, oil for Bitcoin, we'll see it on the ledger. It'll be hard to hide large transactions on the public ledger, right? Now, let's think about it for a second. There's Bitcoin, the commodity, right? There's Bitcoin, the commodity that has this public ledger. There is block space that you can use to try to find ways to get privacy. But really the issue is confiscatability, right? Can it be confiscated? That's what's happening in Canada. So at one end, we're going to see Bitcoin on the confiscatable side becoming an interesting story, right? Now, they're saying exchanges don't promote self-custody. Of course, that's never going to happen. Everyone always promotes self-custody around Bitcoin. And so that train is going to continue to be there. And you're going to start to see that the ability to seize the money is one transaction, one thing that can't be internalized in the States. It's going to be really hard to do, right? They can get surveillance onto a blockchain. They can get surveillance. They can use graph analysis. They can do all these forensic audits and find people. That's not quite the same thing, right? So at one end, trading oil for Bitcoin publicly, right? We don't need privacy on this. What we need is transparency all the way up. We have to be able to know what's going on with all of these American institutions that are doing business in Ukraine, right? We have to know. Otherwise, we can't make a decision. Nobody in America can make a decision right now or even tell you what's going on in Ukraine because we don't know. Any opinion that doesn't take into account the money is not worth it, right? Because what we see in Ukraine right now is a situation purely about money, right? There could be some history there, there's other pieces, but really, we don't know how much American exposure and interests are there. We just don't know, right? And I'm not trying to take Putin's side or that's not the point, right? Left or right, Republican or Democrat, on this issue, doesn't know what's going on. Those transactions, those relationships, those financial relationships are just not public. And the only way forward is to ask for that radical transparency upwards. The problem with Bitcoin not being private enough is not going to save anyone, I don't think. I think Zuko had it right on one end, right? That it won't protect you from people looking at you. It will protect you from an imbalance of power if the US dollar can't be used as the only market for energy in the world. And that's what it looks like we're headed to, right? And so when I look at what's going on in Ukraine, I can't help but think that the only answer is to push for more transparency and frankly, to start using our own forensic auditing capabilities. I mean, Chainalysis did a great job on the DAO guy. Where the heck are they finding out what's going on with American interests in Ukraine? Why isn't anyone looking into that from the crypto Bitcoin end, right? Why aren't we looking to find if there's any other activity going on that might be friendly? We don't know, right? We don't know. So for me, when I look at this Coase theorem, when I look at just the contortions of the system, the way it should work, the way a noise complaint ought to work, the way international organization ought to work, right? These institutions, NATO, all these things are supposed to work, but we don't know if they're working anymore. We couldn't tell. No, even if something broke out in Ukraine today, we wouldn't know what's going on, who's on what side, what they're fighting for, simply because we have no clue about their incentives. So while it might look bad that there was this forensic success on Bitcoin, that whole field of privacy, confidentiality, are additional pieces, right? The commodity of Bitcoin, the ability to take away the fiat monetary policy is independent of its privacy qualities. They're not related. In fact, the transparency of the public blockchain can help us understand what the financial relationships are that are affecting vital decisions for international security. We just don't know who's on what team right now, right? That's today's episode.